Hello. This little piece concerns some dialogue that's been kicking around the Adept Play site for a bit, and it goes back to points that have been under discussion either at Adept Play, scattered through the different seminars and presentations, and also dates way back to dialogues, good solid, up to 15 years ago. So with new participants in the dialogue and with a lot of play experience happening right now and over the past year that's really relevant, I think it's a good time to revisit it, open it up as a new topic of discussion if necessary. Who knows, maybe the old dialogues need rebreathing. Let's see. The topic is this. We'll start with two big old categories. And one of them is socializing and play as a form of socializing. And in situations where people gather for leisure activities together, some brand of organizing is involved. And sometimes it's, scheduling, and sometimes it's context, like, whether there's food and stuff like that. Sometimes it's finances. Of the need to purchase certain things, or collections, or whatever it takes. Transport and is obviously involved in a lot of cases. And finally, the presentation of the activity. Can be that contains the possibility of actually teaching the activity. Somewhat more generally, perhaps it could include promoting the activity or gathering people as part of convincing them to continue to do so. That's distinct from a situation where we all know the activity and we're just gathering to do it. But that could be involved. As I say, it may involve managing the learning curve of the activity. So anyway, all of these go into that zone. Who are we doing this? How are we going to get together to do it? What is it going to be like physically and socially to do it? Stuff like that. Commitments for how long we're going to do it. All these things. Now, the important thing about such stuff is that an idealized form of kind of throw it in democracy typically doesn't work. And in all sorts of endeavors, professional or leisure, we often see the big, shuffling of who is in charge of making that happen, who is in charge of making that happen. And that's ordinary behavior. So in role-playing, we often find that this tends to get concentrated much more than in other activities. And bearing in mind, I am just talking about the whole socially organizing kind of thing. To what extent that's concentrated on one person? Oh, obviously, I forgot to mention something when I said about where. Hosting, right? Who is actually going to be whose place are we going to, right? But it's not just a location. I mean, one person, therefore, the person who lives there or for some other reason is considered to be the host. With all this in mind, is this all just one person? Is a perfectly valid question for your particular experience. If it is all one person, why? Does it have to be all one person? And so on and so forth. I think in my experience, in a lot of groups, you'll often find that even though nobody's, sat down and passed out slips of paper, or, nobody's held up their hand and volunteered in particular ways, but often a lot of the details within this material, this set of activities, does tend to shuffle across the group to some extent. I'm kind of interested in the default or subcultural assumption, however, that the sort of the starting concept is that it is all one person. Okay, but that aside, now we go all the way over to playing the game itself and its procedures and the things that need to be done for there to be fiction in operation. So with this, I've often used the term authorities, and I'm right in the middle of teaching this to a whole bunch of people formally right now. So I have this huge, refined way of presenting this so that various misconceptions don't occur. But right now, I want to just look at the different things that have to be done for fiction to occur. We need to know. Let's back up. What things have to be done? There is knowledge, and knowledge can be about the setting. It can be about characters. It can be about past events. It can be about psychology. It can be about, abilities and stuff like that, but knowledge, right? And the revealing of knowledge to others is what I'm talking about. Which pieces of knowledge are revealed to the group before play, during play, which are necessarily revealed, and which ones are, opportunistically or conditionally revealed. And most importantly, for each sort of knowledge, who does that? So, for example, you may have a situational backstory that one person has come up with or will be coming up with during play, either one. And that person basically is that in charge of that. You can have other games where aspects of the situational backstory are brought to play, in with each character as well as this other person. Or you could have had some sort of round robin thing where everybody throws stuff in a hat and, pick it out and say, oh, these are the situational backstory elements or whatever. Or you can have things where quite a bit of it is not known and revealed later in play, but rather is actually created during play. I don't really care about the differences among these techniques. What I am saying is that it can be centralized or distributed among participants in a wide variety of ways. So I'm typically calling that backstory authority, and it's just one of 4. So rather than go through them all in detail and have everybody quibble, I want to simply point out that there are, 4 whole huge banks of authority, of which this backstory or knowledge-y one is just one. And if that one, since I've just shown that one can in fact either be concentrated in one person or distributed across categories of knowledge and people, the same goes for all the others. It's the same for situational authority, it's the same for outcome authority, and it's the same for narration authority. That's my insight, is that not only are these 4 types of authority independent of one another, they can be made intertwined or dependent on one another through the rules of a particular game, but that's taking them and making, and hitching them. They aren't intrinsically connected to one another in terms of how they're organized. So that's the 4 being unhitched from each other. And then within each one, it's spray of possibilities for how it's distributed among the participants. So think of 4 little boxes, and then in each one, kind of this Roman candle of, all the different ways you can do it. And then you can see, how the parts and pieces go together for a given game. Now, the conduct of those things, if they're concentrated in one person, so the group, people shrug and say, well, that's, except for these little teeny tiny things, that's all just this one person. That person, has all 4 authorities most of the time. And not only that, but within each one, they carry the bulk of that authority within each one as well. So again, concentration, right? So my insight is, there's a couple. First, that, careful what you describe when you don't actually examine play. We often find authorities spraying all over the place, very structurally, even when people don't know they're doing it and would swear up and down that, that guy has all the authority about that if you asked them. Well, anyways, though, just as before, I'm pointing out that pound for pound in the hobby, there's a tendency to assume that all the authorities not only are squished together into the same kind of phenomenon, which they're not, and not only that, but that a given person is carrying the bulk of them as sort of a default notion of role-playing or stuff like that. So do you see what I mean? Over here in all the social organizing stuff, there's this business about, how come we don't distribute, that one? Why does the host have to be the same person as the organizer of play? Why does the organizer of play have to be the same person as the primary teacher of how to play this game? We could go on and on and on. And you can say, well, we don't. We've distributed it around our group. Look at that. And I say, yes, a lot of them do. But conceptually, there is a tendency to think of this person as the same and to often expect it. So then we go over to the procedures of play itself, and we see similarly this notion of concentration, squishing together, centralization of these tasks. I could add another one that's sort of in the first one and about the second, which is the ongoing kind of necessary application of, if we're using a rule book, and then what on the world does that mean? What in the world does that mean for what we actually do at the table? Well, is that the same person as the person who has, say, backstory and a lot of the situational authority, if there is such a person? Is that the same person? And is that the same person who organized play, said, hey, let's play this game? You see what I mean? None of those hitchings together necessarily have to be the case. And not only is it not necessarily the case, it may not even be a very good idea for that always to be the case, or for that particular combination to be, thought of as a better combination. I urge you, in fact, to understand and decouple these concepts as much as you can. Not necessarily because I think they all need to be exploded apart as a process of play. Should you care, for example, should you prefer to play in this game with the authorities more clumped, both across their four types and within each of the four types, then you go right ahead. There are lots and lots and lots of functional game designs that use that model, and yours that you are working on, if you are, might be one of them, and more power to you. The point is that that is a design decision and has no particular privileged position in terms of the functionality of play. And I will also point out that should one be in the position of promoting either the activity of role-playing as such, or within the activity of role-playing among people who are familiar with it, this particular game as opposed to the zillion others we might be playing, so you're kind of advocating for this game, and you are teaching this game to the others, and at the same time, you're trying actually to play the game in the way that your participation is designated, and you're playing in such a fashion that you are taking on a lot of the authorities, and you are also in this business of kind of coping with what the text actually says, and now, for the first time, actually trying to manage it at the table, because it tends to sort of twist on you there, and you suddenly realize that it read one way, and now you're doing it, and that's not what you thought. So who knows? But the point is, you put all those together into one person sitting there, and even if they're not, the host in the location, and even if they're not the person who has all these authorities but is still coping with all that difficulty, it's extraordinarily difficult to do that. And it seems to me as though creating a noun or a personal label that carries all this weight, so that, and confounding all these different things together. So for example, let's say we're going to play this particular game and you are going to be the person who is the holder of backstory and situational authority for a great deal of play. Does that necessarily mean that you have to be the person who really thinks about the rules the hardest in terms of how they're going to apply, and the rest of us are perfectly happy with you kind of taking point on that? Why is that the same person? Why is that person also perhaps taken as a given that they have to organize the group and schedule everybody? When are we going to meet? And we all look at that person just because they're going to be carrying the role of situational and backstory authority, most of it during play. There's no connection between those two concepts. None. And yet, the GM represents any degree of the concentration of these concepts, either within categories or across them, including across the two biggest ones, right? All the social organizing and all the procedures of play. Concentrating them and presuming because of one then the other, or even more so because of one, all the others, or an enormous amount of the others, that should that person say, but I don't want to have it at my place, that's sort of a de-escalation of the GM-ness. Or they say, I'm not the rules jock. I'm good enough with the game that I'll handle those tasks of play. But that's not the same thing as being the person who really is going to look up, wait a minute, what about the criticals on that table? And the other person who's totally on it and likes this sort of thing goes, says so. No, and they even take point on recognizing that this needs to come into play at this time. What does that have to do with situational and backstory authority? Nothing. I'm all about the tasks in play that are typically labeled as the game master when they come in one of the many possible concentrated forms. There's hundreds of ways to concentrate or to combine all those different authority-based tasks in play, as well as, which particular rules applications, I roll for this, you roll for that kind of thing. If that gets concentrated in some particular way around one person and the others are all distributed variously, there's hundreds of different nodes of concentration like that possible. If you want to call any one of those the game master for a particular game, you go right ahead, and you can say that in the rules, and that's what we call it in the rules, or we call it the producer or the narrator or the referee or any of the other terms that various games have used for this. Fine. But the GM, which connotes a particular concentration of those things and association with all the other things, is just bonkers. It is counterfactual, and it is high pressure. Someone says, I'd really like to play this game. We say, hey, why don't you be the game master? Oh, no, I can't handle teaching all the rules to everybody. And at that point, I kind of go, well, who said anything about that? Let Bob do it. He's the one who's bonkers too he's just as bonkers about playing the game as you are. He's totally about this. He's, bouncing in here with his elbows going up and down, to play this game. Well, Bob do the heavy lifting on where the critical hit table is. We know when we'll run into it and play. Bob will be alert to it. We'll make him some NPCs and play them. What does that have to do with you? It's really hard to get this through people's skulls. You say GMing. You say the GM. And the idea that you're den daddy taking care of the group, that you're going to socially organize and have the final word on this schedule, that you're going to kind of, make sure everybody's okay. I mean, socially kind of a glue person, or, settle down, or, hey, let's get excited, kind of person. Why does, even within the social thing itself, why does every one of those functions have to be the same person? And the use of that term with the definite article, the game master, has coalesced into basically a social and creative abomination. Not because any one of these concentrated nodes of activity is bad. In fact, I can't think of any one of them that's bad. What's abominable, is the presumption of concentration and the drawing in of factors across this whole array that are presumed to go with it. So, you have people who really have created this whole hierarchy. There are game masters and there are players. And they have these remarkable expectations for what the former, can and is willing to do, when quite a bit of it, is quite properly, as anyone engaged in social leisure activities would tell you, quite properly better off distributed around a little bit. So, is game mastering bad? No. Of course, what that means for a particular game, in terms of its rules and procedures, is a very individualized thing for that game. Is organizing, taking a leadership role about getting this together, is that a bad thing? No. I'm talking about the presumption of combination, coalescence of a lot more of these parts than this particular game and this particular social group calls for. That's my rant, if it's a rant, because I don't think it's a rant at all. I think this abomination is directly interfering with real people's happiness.